it's now reached a point where I think you've got both secular decline of manufacturing coupled with an acceleration of that contraction because of a failure to address the energy input side of the equation. Turning all of that around is incredibly difficult. You've got massive infrastructure issues that need to be addressed. Problems that emerged over 40 to 50 years isn't solved in 4 days, let alone 4 years or 5 years. It's going to take a long-term commitment.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the What the Finance podcast. On this episode, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Warwick Powell. So Warwick is an adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology, working in the intersection of China, digital technology, supply chains, financial flows, and global political economy and governance. So Warwick, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Good to be back with you.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation. As I was saying before, we haven't spoken since February, and since then there's definitely been lots of things happening around the globe. Liberation Day, putting tariffs on, taking them away. All these Japan now recently sort of going quite hawkish against China. So there's definitely been a lot happening. So it'd be really interesting to hear your own view of, I guess, what we've seen this year and how it's shifted, relations between these big powers.
Yeah, look, as you say, we've had a lot going on in the time between when you and I last spoke. The US economy, I think, continues to be a central part of the story, as well as, of course, what's happening in China, and ultimately also what's going on in the battlefields of Ukraine, which in many respects is the defining crucible, if you will, of contemporary global tensions, and which will ultimately, I think, play an incredibly important role, if not a decisive role, in how aspects of the multipolar world continues to unfold. So I think what I would probably generally say, Anthony, about the state of the world, if you will, is that the dynamics that have been driving multipolarization or the emergence of a multinodal economic structure globally continue to power away. Those forces have been in place now for many decades, but have gathered a level of momentum or a head of steam that will continue driving these transformations forward. China's economy is central to that because the Chinese economy, its growth and its role in global in investment networks anchors a lot of these transformations, and ultimately also through its interactions with a host of other nations are enabling the establishment and consolidation of new parallel institutions to those that have dominated the global economic architecture over the last 7 or 8 decades. These new institutions are in some respects complementary to many of the existing institutions and platforms, but at the same time also can function, should they need to function, as discrete alternatives. So the evidence in that regard, for example, is in the ongoing development of non-US dollar-based cross-border payments platforms and the extent to which trade amongst nations in the world is increasingly being settled in non-US dollar terms. That's not a move that aims to undermine the US dollar per se, but it's actually a direct move to enhance the ability of individual nations to trade with confidence, to reduce their risks, to exchange rate volatility, to system weaponization, etc., etc. And I think we will continue to see those sorts of issues unfold. The US economy, contrary to, I think, some of the usual political talk from the administration, is actually facing some pretty significant headwinds. These are headwinds that in part are cyclical, but in part are deeply structural. And in particular, I think we have the emergence of significant bottlenecks around American energy systems. Those have come to light largely as a result of the massive growth in the AI sector and the demands that AI is placing on the electricity supply systems in North America. It's clear to me that the electricity supply infrastructure, both at the generation end, but also in terms of its distribution network, are under tremendous strain, and that these strains are now becoming increasingly apparent in terms of rising prices for both alternative industrial uses of electricity as well as price increases for households. And these issues, I think, are going to place a greater strain on the American political economy for the foreseeable future, creating incredible social pressures as well as economic pressures on the North American economic system at large. Add on top of that what is in effect the failure of Trump economics, insofar as the all-out attempt to rewrite global trade and the dynamics of trade insofar as North America is concerned, I think has left the United States economy probably a little bit more vulnerable than it was at the beginning of the year. And that's a little bit ironic and a bit paradoxical, but it has, I think, showed that that the US economy is no longer in a position to support unilateral decision-making and impositions across the globe. So there's some of the features, I think, that that we've seen unfold over the course of the last 10 or 11 months, and the forces at work will continue to shape the world for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, thanks for laying that out. So how do you see this, I guess, attempt to shift trade and the US economy in general? Has this just accelerated that shift away from, I guess, this US hegemonic system to, I guess we're getting now these spheres of influence? Do you think that's accelerated it, or what impact has that had on the shift?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that it's accelerated both the politics as well as the economics of the supply chain reorientation globally and institution building, right? So the US economy now represents somewhere a little bit less than 14% of total global imports. So in that sense, it's actually not as important as it once was. In times past, some decades ago, it was well over 25% of global imports. So you could see how it played actually a really important role in the post-war years as far as being a major market is concerned. But it's no longer that. It was only a year ago about 13% of China's imports or China's exports, whereas now it's fallen to less than 10%. In other words, the leverage that the American economy can play insofar as it being a market for the goods that are created in other parts of the world has diminished over time. We've seen actually that that many of the headline tariffs that were introduced as part of the so-called Liberation Day moves back on 2nd of April this year have largely fallen by the wayside. So there is a big difference between headline numbers, which capture the attention of people in the moment when they get announced, versus the reality of numerous exemptions being progressively announced. And they've been announced in large part because those additional costs that were being imposed on imports into the North American economy were starting to feed their way through into higher prices. The experiences of the last 9 to 10 months have, I think, hopefully put to bed once and for all the lie that tariffs are paid for by exporters. There isn't a skerrick of evidence which suggests that that is the case at all. In fact, all of the evidence points to the fact that importing entities carry the majority of the burden in the first rounds, and progressively over time, those burdens are ultimately passed on to consumers downstream, and so the American enterprises and American households ultimately have to carry some of these costs, which does impact on downstream employment. So what you protect upstream leads to increased costs, which ultimately affects what happens downstream from you. And so over the course of the last 5 months or so, the US administration has actually quietly implemented a whole raft of, and an ever expanding raft of, exemptions because of the realities that tariffs didn't deliver what they promised to, but that in fact they led to upward pressure on prices in America, and those prices had to be alleviated through exemptions. So it's been, in many regards, a bit of a fizzer. All right, it's caused significant disruptions to enterprises and to nations as they scrambled to work out how it might or might not affect them. But the wash up is that the North American economy has been buffeted by increased cost pressures. Manufacturing, incidentally, has continued to shrink in North America. Employment in manufacturing has been falling consistently during the course of this year. So the promises that were made on the back of this, tariffs idea simply haven't come true. America is going to need to rethink its economic policy approach because the problems that led to all of these responses, the decline in industry, the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector, etc., all of those remain problems. It's just that if your diagnostics leads you to a simplistic prognosis, which is that American production problems are ultimately trade problems, then you've really, in many ways, misdiagnosed the causes of your problems. So the symptomology, I think, isn't going to go away. People continue to hurt. Real incomes haven't increased. Households continue to be under incredible pressure in terms of private household loans, the rising cost of many goods and services, and real wage increases that are in effect flat. And those things aren't going to go away. The policy responses that have been rolled out this year in response to those problems simply haven't done the trick. So they're going to have to go back to the drawing board. Whether they can or not in the short term will depend in part on the politics of Congress. And the next 12, 18 months is going to be, I think, an incredibly fascinating period, because we're going to be entering into midterm election season soon, and anything can happen.
Yeah, great. So what would you say are the drivers of those problems? Because I think it's something that the Western world is all experiencing. And, I'm normally based in the UK and Europe, and we see there's just these challenges of keeping these manufacturing alive, especially when, for example, there was a chemical facility that shut down in the UK. I think it was refining as well. And it doesn't make sense because energy prices are so high, and you can just import it for far cheaper from the Asian world. So then basically there's no way that these companies can compete. So I guess that's one example. But yeah, why do you think manufacturing and other of these heavy industries have been destroyed in these countries?
Well, it's a 50-year process, right? So progressive deindustrialization of Western economies and the decline in the role of manufacturing as a major employer has been a reality that we have been witnessing now for 5 decades. I remember reading books written in the 1970s lamenting the hollowing out of manufacturing, whether it was in the UK or in the US. So these aren't new problems. Now, these problems have emerged in large part because American capital, initially, and eventually European and UK capital, relocated to other parts of the world where they could find lower cost production options, or they progressively imported capital equipment to automate processes on the home front. This has been going on now for 5 decades. The other thing that's underpinned all of this has been the continued expansion and the accelerated rate of expansion of the financial sector in Western economies, whereby these sectors, whether it's in finance, insurance, and to some extent also in real estate, though real estate itself shouldn't be confused with the production of buildings. It really should be seen as a financial asset class. The expansion and the accelerated rate of expansion of these sectors has contributed directly to the hollowing out of manufacturing. When money capital, has growing options to realize monetary profits through the trading of financial instruments rather than through commitments to expanding fixed capital, development, whether it's machines and factories and let alone training people, then the resources that could have been committed to ongoing innovation and the building of the infrastructure that you need to sustain long-term innovation in manufacturing simply doesn't happen. Over time, what was once leading technology becomes legacy technology and is overtaken by more efficient systems in other parts of the world. And we've seen that happen across the West. Recent events in Europe in particular that have led to increased energy costs in many regards just exposed the soft underbelly that was already in place well before the energy spikes. And it's now reached a point where I think you've got both secular decline of manufacturing coupled with an acceleration of that contraction because of a failure to address the energy input side of the equation. Turning all of that around is incredibly difficult. You've got massive infrastructure issues that need to be addressed. Problems that emerged over 40 to 50 years isn't solved in 4 days, let alone 4 years or 5 years. It's going to take a long-term commitment. The last thing is that a lot of the requirements from a labour force point of view in contemporary manufacturing and all of the supply chains that are associated with it, whether it's in advanced chemistry or materials, robotics, electronics, etc., demand a level of skill in terms of literacy and numeracy that simply is not evident in sufficient numbers in Western economies today. There are many reports now that show, for instance, that literacy and numeracy standards in North America continue to decline in very alarming ways. I saw a report earlier this week on declining numeracy standards in North America amongst college graduates and high school graduates, and ultimately, of course, right through the adult workforce. None of this is going to contribute to a rapid turnaround in manufacturing or modern manufacturing. And you're not going to see a relocation of manual intensive labor manufacturing activities into North America or into the Western European, UK environments either. So the promises around all of this stuff that somehow tariffs is going to bring manufacturing back was always futile. It was premised on bad diagnostics, but it was ultimately a politics of cultural grievance mixed with nostalgia. Made people feel better. They could express their anger about the accumulated state of circumstance that they find themselves and their communities in. There were promises around quick fixes, which in today's meme society seems to be something that people want. The last thing people want to be told is that a 40 to 50 year problem is going to take a generation to 2 generations to address. And there's no commitments at all from either government or private capital to addressing the underlying causes of these challenges either.
There were lots of countries that sort of came in and sort of promised to do these massive, investments into the US. And if we look at sort of how capital's flown previously, it's been more into the financial world, as you said, into equities, into investments first, into actual capital investments into the US. So there were these promises, but do you think will this be enough, or do you think it's just promises and it may not go through? How are you seeing those?
Well, at the end of the day, if you're a sovereign currency issuing nation, your problem is not a shortage of money capital. Your problems are systemic in terms of what causes that money capital to flow into certain activities and not others. And secondly, they go to the availability of the right kinds of resources that you need to have to develop different kinds of industrial activities. I touched on the human resources question, for example, but there are other things too. There's a whole bunch of raw materials that modern manufacturing simply needs to be able to create components that ultimately are assembled in final product. Most final goods in today's world is a combination of many subcomponents that ultimately also rely upon raw materials from quite a number of parts of the world. And so there really isn't an economic system or a production system that is entirely detached from global supply chains. The same goes for China, by the way. Many of China's, in fact, most of China's recent export growth sectors, in EVs and in solar panels, et cetera, batteries, they are all dependent upon a whole bunch of raw materials that come from other parts of the world. In fact, those input costs from outside of China make up the lion's share of the production costs of the final product. So there isn't a production system globally now in any country in the world, particularly in sophisticated manufacturers, that is detached from what goes on elsewhere. So for North America and Europe and the UK for that matter, to rejuvenate manufacturing actually requires them not to close up shop, but to find ways of integrating into global supply chains that provide them with access to stable, low cost and reliable flows of inputs. And I think that they're struggling to achieve that. The other thing to bear in mind is that modern manufacturing is increasingly dependent on all sorts of capital equipment, of course, but a particular kind of capital equipment, which is an information-intensive capital equipment, robotics and automation. And so you've got sophisticated machinery on the one hand that only works and functions properly when it's integrated into high-performance information networks. Now, AI in theory may contribute to that, but you also need 5G and 6G communications networks to be able to deliver the data to a network of devices to enable them to do what they're meant to do at the right time. Now, where's the commitment to building out those sorts of systems? You contrast that with how AI and communications have been rolled out in China over the last so many years, and you have really a black and white contrast, which I think people in the West should really, sit up and pay attention to, rather than pursue grand dreams of artificial general intelligence. In other words, to sort of play God. The Chinese experience with AI and modern technology has really been about how do you embed high volume data processing capabilities into functional economic systems so as to speed up processes and reduce the energetic and financial costs of running these systems at large. And you can see as a result of those commitments and those investments in energy and in information technologies that Chinese productivity system-wide is at a level that Western economic systems are now struggling to match. And without a focus on those things, the ability for Western economies to replicate those sorts of production systems, I think, will be substantially diminished. Now, whether they should or shouldn't is a different question, right? But assuming that these are worthwhile and meaningful and legitimate objectives, then there's a lot of homework that's going to need to be done before the transatlantic economies are going to be back in the game again.
Yeah, maybe a bit of a shift. How do you see AI sort of impacting, I guess, the employment moving forward? Because I think that's going to be a big concern of if you have a large young population that is unemployed or can't find work, you can imagine that could provide large instability. So how do you see that shifting? Will it be the industrial revolution? Will there be lots of more jobs, new jobs, or do you see it being different?
Well, the optimists will always say that new jobs will get created, right? And the pessimists, and we've had them through many episodes of technological change throughout recent history over the last few centuries in particular. The pessimists will say that that this is the end of the world, Chicken Little. We can go back to the time of Ludd and his followers, going around destroying spinning jennies because they were worried that it would lead to the destruction of a whole bunch of industries around, cotton spinning. Well, in fact, what we saw was the emergence of British global capital on the back of on the back of steam-driven spinning jennies, so which created a whole bunch of new jobs. I'm neither pessimistic nor optimistic in the sense that I don't think that somehow we're going to end up at nirvana on Earth just because we've got AI and technology coming. But what I do think will continue to happen, as has always happened, is that certain kinds of job roles and activities will be replaced by technologies. There will be disruptions as a consequence of that to both individuals and also to organizations and communities, and that there will also be new things emerge which are similarly disruptive, right? Because embedding in new activities in ways that don't challenge older things or obsolete things is always difficult. Because systems that have embedded processes and embedded technologies and embedded vested interests will work tirelessly to delay their own obsolescence. And, one useful way to think about some of these things is, rather than think about jobs being replaced per se, it might be worth thinking about how automation, whether they be in algorithms which allow essentially high volume processing of information, let's call that the white collar piece. And then you've got the blue collar manual work, which is increasingly being done by machines of one sort or another. Anything that is able to be rendered into predictable routines will be amenable to replacement quickly. Things that are more difficult to be rendered into repeatable routines, non-routine manual work and non-routine cognitive work, are areas in which humans continue to excel and in which humans can, I think, continue to flourish through the development and application of their, I was going to say, well, really of our creative capabilities. So, these are going to be the challenges. Now, part of the challenge in these transitional moments is actually the speed, right? Change, when it takes place slowly, often doesn't even feel like change. You just sort of slowly adapt, and then you look back in the rear vision mirror and realize that the world today looks very different from the world of, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But sometimes we experience change in incredibly fast ways and find it difficult to adapt. And I get the sense that in certain areas of social and economic life, this is precisely what's happening at the moment. And because of that intensification and that acceleration of our experiences and the transformations that are taking place around us, we are going through a period of, quite serious social and personal psychological displacement.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like it's going to continue to accelerate moving forward, which, as you said, humans get used to things, but it's just hoping that we continue to be adaptable to what's happening in the world. So if we maybe take a pivot, you were mentioning sort of, I guess, alliances, and it does seem that since Trump's come in, I'm not sure if this is maybe just the perception and what we're seeing in the news. It seems that there's been a real focus on allies picking sides blatantly, whereas I guess previously there was this focus with Biden and I guess the Trump first term, but it was less blatant than what we're seeing now, with Australia and India. Is that something that you've seen as well? Is that the right way to sort of frame it? And then what will that mean moving forward?
Look, the transatlantic economies that have dominated global economic and political affairs for a number of centuries, crescendoing with the last 35 years of American unipolar dominance, is seeking to hold back the tides of change. And in doing so, they unsurprisingly find comfort in banding together. This is a case of the colonial powers circling the wagons as the world around them changes. This is a world in which the United States has, in many regards, given up the pretense that it was the leader of a liberal order, and has revealed its truer colours. Now, those true colours, of course, have always been part and parcel of this so-called liberal rules-based international order, namely that the United States could absolve itself from the rules that it imposed on everyone else whenever it so chose. Now, in saying so, I don't think I'm being particularly radical or controversial. Many realist scholars, Patrick Porter, John Mearsheimer, and a bunch of others, have actually written far more eloquently than me about the mythology of the rules-based international order. And so when systems come under stress and when actors come under stress, in many ways, the pretenses that they used to carry themselves with just go away. Those pretenses took energy. So, when you're under political and economic stress, why bother with the pretense? And we are seeing that, I think, emerge in not only in North America and how it relates to the rest of the world, but also in how parts of Western Europe are starting to think about their own positions in their part of the world, and as well continuing to believe that they have both an obligation and a right to impose themselves across other parts of the globe, whether it's in Africa, Latin America, or in Asia. So the idea of this transatlantic world bandying together as the world that they became accustomed to collapses around them, slowly but surely fades away, is, I think, part and part is quite a natural reaction to a world that in many ways doesn't resemble the world that they once, particularly the elites in those countries, enjoyed and assumed would continue to exist forever. But as I touched on right at the outset, the forces that are driving these changes aren't going away. And at some point in time, the attempts by these colonial forces and colonial powers to hold back these tides of change will simply confront a reality that they can't hold back any further. And the question will be, how well placed are they to adapt to these new realities in a way that enables them to contribute to how these realities will unfold, because they certainly can contribute to how these realities will unfold, as opposed to simply trying to hold things back. And in the processes of contributing to how these realities will unfold, they may also be beneficiaries of an emerging multinodal world. But right now, the large sections of the transatlantic elite are doubling down on the world that once existed, and they are seeking to delay the emergence of multipolarity to the extent that they can. I think it's a futile or a fool's errand what they're trying to do, but try they will.
Yeah, no, it does seem like that. And can there be institutions? I guess we've mentioned there's going to be probably multinodal. There'll be different, I guess, institutions in different parts of the world that sort of focus on different countries, or maybe they'll interlink. I guess it'll be interesting to see how they collaborate. But will it sort of shift to a China-dominated system? Do you see that? And I guess how strong would these institutions be? And it's, I guess, in the second node, if competing interests were to come into play, because I guess that's always a challenge with any of these things, and in any system, it's once people start competing, or once the interests sort of are diverging between the different parties, that's when there's challenges of keeping these institutions together.
Yeah, look, one of the interesting dynamics, I think, of this unfolding multipolarity is that it has many layers as well, right? So it's not just a two-dimensional landscape with multiple nodes, which I guess connotes this picture that we're transitioning from a world where the world was mainly organized around a central fulcrum, and then you had semi-peripheral and peripheral nations, to one in which there are many nodes and that those nodes interact with each other, not just in a hubs and spokes kind of way, but also in a much more complex web-like structure. So that's a two-dimensional aspect of this emerging multipolar world. But there are layers as well. And so we see many kinds of multilateral institutions both exist already as legacy institutions of the post-war settlement, as well as new multilateral institutions that have emerged over the last so many decades. And some of them are relatively new, but nonetheless are gaining a head of steam. Organizations like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, organizations in Africa, ASEAN, which of course has a long multi-decade pedigree as the premier institution of regional multipolarity and consensus building in Asia, and of course institutions, economic collaboration institutions in Latin America. So we have many layers of multipolar alignment setting through these sorts of institutions. We also have a fabric, if you will, of trade and investment organizations, particularly in trade. You know, of course, there is the World Trade Organization, which has the largest membership. But within the World Trade Organization environment, there are many, there's almost 200 actually, subordinate trade agreements that are multilateral or bilateral in nature. And these institutions, these lower level trade arrangements, ultimately is where a lot of the heavy lifting these days takes place, as far as setting a whole bunch of rules about how countries and their enterprises will trade with each other, and how they can comply with each other's expectations and requirements for market access, but also for system interoperability. So the other thing that we're seeing in a multinodal environment is, of course, the re-emergence of a stronger emphasis on questions of national sovereignty. And we see that in all sorts of domains, including, of course, information systems. But broadly speaking, countries are looking for ways in which their ability to exercise a higher order of sovereign capacity to manage what comes in and out of their countries, to manage the affairs of their societies and their economies. So we've got a combination of an intensification, actually, of multilateral institutions in parallel to a greater sense of national sovereignty, certainly a demand for national sovereignty. And so this places new sets of challenges, particularly insofar as interoperability is concerned. So how is it that sovereign nations nonetheless are able to interoperate with each other without subordinating their sovereign interests and their sovereign capabilities to some supranational body, right? So how do we maintain sovereignty whilst ensuring we can align, coordinate, collaborate, etc., etc.? So, these again are some of the features, I think, of the world as they continue to, unfold, and some of that poses challenges to the legacy institutions and the legacy powers of the post-war era, and some of them create new platforms for countries that have long been excluded, really, from mainstream political and economic discourse globally, to find room to air their own priorities and to pursue their own series of relationships with others that they will hope will provide them and their people with prosperity, security, and improved standards of living.
Okay. Do you see this sort of moving into like a European Union type alliance, or do you think it'd be a lot more looser and a lot more different to that?
Well, I don't think anyone else in the world is going to go down the European Union path. Countries around the world have been able to observe the European Union and its machinations now for a number of decades. And I'm not convinced that the European Union and its experiences is a particularly edifying one, particularly in the context of countries at the same time today seeking to amplify their own sense of national sovereignty. it seems to me that a more functional model, if we're looking for a model, is going to be found in ASEAN, right, which is far more focused on facilitating alignments and consensus rather than ones that seek to create a supranational body that can create rules and legislation and regulations and requirements that supersede those of the individual member states. So I doubt that the EU, firstly, will constitute a model that others will seek to emulate. And in any regards, one must, I think, today wonder whether or not the EU as it exists has a long future in it, or whether it's going to also give way to these forces of national sovereignty and the sort of centrifugal forces that are pulling at the European Union. Now, the European Union has been, in large parts, a racialized project. It emerged in Western Europe, firstly with a view to ensuring a connection was maintained in the post-war years to African colonies, but at the same time keeping those North African colonies and other colonies in the African continent in their place. And in due course, the relationship between Western Europe and the Slavic people and the non-Protestant religions to the south and the east was also articulated through this prism of a very Western Europe. And I don't think it's actually delivered for many of those who were drawn into its orbit. I mean, if it had, then I don't think we'd be seeing as many complaints about the state of Europe and the state of the economies in different member states today than we are seeing. I mean, I'll put it quite bluntly. I don't think the European Union has worked in the interests of ordinary Europeans.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So if we go back to, you're talking about currencies, I guess this new system of transactions between, I guess, the different nodes and a shift away from the US dollar. So you mentioned sort of transactions between their own individual currencies. So is that where you see it trajectorying? Do you see it sort of going to maybe a gold-backed currency? Do you see it moving in another direction? How do you analyze that?
Look, I doubt that there'll be a gold-backed currency. I mean, I know people talk about it a lot. A lot of that's based on the mythologies itself of, the gold standard, which were never in reality the foundations of monetary systems in times past. I mean, gold did play a more prominent role in times past, but it certainly wasn't the only anchor. And I think that there's a lot of mythology around the gold standard in any regard. We live in the 21st century in an era of explicit fiat currencies. And those fiat currencies are anchored ultimately by what you can exchange those currencies for, and where you can and with whom you can exchange those currencies, right, for things. So, and this goes back to really the foundational question of economic systems as production systems. One of the reasons why the US dollar is diminishing in relative importance, in part, is because the North American economy doesn't create things, doesn't manufacture and make things that the rest of the world wants. That's all. It's not an indictment on anything. It's simply that if enterprises and individuals in other parts of the world need to access certain things, commodities, technologies, etc., etc., and if you don't need US dollars to exchange for those things, then the US dollar is going to become less important. You can use other things. The fact that energy, since the mid-1970s, particularly oil, was in large part tethered to the US dollar as its principal means of exchange. The fact that you don't need US dollars to trade oil now simply says that the world is able to move on, and that's what it's doing. Russia-China trade, $250 billion or so of trade, and growing. It's almost all done in RMB or ruble. 95, 96% or more. And that's just happened in 4 years. So the speed of change can be incredibly fast if countries are pushed or are forced to make these changes. And we're also starting to see a growth in countries and companies in other countries issuing RMB bonds, right? I mean, I think this is a very interesting emerging dynamic where Hungary, Russia, and a bunch of other countries are actually issuing RMB denominated bonds. Well, because this is their way of getting access to RMB that they wish to use to facilitate trade. So we've got a few dynamics at work. One is the weaponization of the US dollar. It makes people nervous. The ongoing debate in Europe about whether or not the Russian sovereign assets should be confiscated or leveraged up, I think sends shivers down the spines of central bankers across the world. This is simply unconducive to the kind of environment that they need to go about doing what they do. So we're now, as a result of those factors, starting to see an acceleration towards currency multipolarity. It reduces costs, right? It creates a safer environment, and it also increases speed. It's faster, it's cheaper, and it's safer. Unsurprisingly, because of that, they've now become more attractive than they ever were, meaning the ability to trade and use other currencies as a global means of payment. You don't need to be too conspiratorial about this to understand the material foundations that is driving these changes.
Yeah, really interesting. And say with the China-Russia trade, once China receives rubles, are they sort of converting that into gold, or are they sort of buying the energy with that, or is there sort of not really that much transparency about what's happening?
Oh, well, they're obviously buying energy from Russia. That's a pretty important part of the story, and other commodities. But it's going to become not just a means of bilateral trade, but when multi-currencies exist and you've got multiple trading pairs and a growing network of trading pairs, then it actually becomes even more viable as these sort of network effects take place for countries to use third-party countries' currencies as part of their own, trading relationships. So, somebody somewhere is going to be happy to take rubles because they're buying Russian gas and oil, for example. Somebody somewhere will be happy to take RMB because they're buying a bunch of stuff from China, whether it's renewable energy technologies or what have you. Just as somebody somewhere is going to be happy enough to take whatever currency it is that they're going to use to purchase raw materials from parts of Africa, North Africa, South America, or wherever. So the more trading pairs you've got, the greater the ability for countries to trade, amongst each other using these different currencies.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So, Warwick, thanks so much for your time today. We sort of covered quite a lot, gone around the globe. But my last question is, what is one message you want people to take away from our conversation?
Look, change is a constant feature of our world. Resisting change is counterproductive and will ultimately lead to disappointment. Understanding change, understanding that it brings with it both risk and opportunity, and understanding a need to find non-violent ways of addressing the consequences of change so that we can arrive at, new settlements, if you will, is actually the most important thing for us at this moment in time. We need to find ways in which countries and peoples across the globe can arrive at new accommodations with each other that don't involve kinetic resolutions of differences, but which can, through persistent dialogue, and these aren't instant solutions, incidentally, but by commitment to non-kinetic problem resolution and by recognition that the world is rarely black and white, then we've got a chance, I think, of actually coming through this period of tumultuous transformation into a stage where multipolarity will be less chaotic and somewhat more fruitful, particularly for countries that have for quite a number of centuries been left out of the major pathways of economic prosperity and material standards of living improvement. So that would be sort of, in a sense, my core message is change is part and parcel of the nature of the world. We need to be being resistant to change, whilst at times a natural first order reaction is one that ultimately needs to give way to a more considered approach to how we can contribute constructively to the dynamics of change and to minimizing the risks that the changes that are taking place lead to kinetic conflicts and fallout.
Yeah, great message. So Warwick, thanks again. If anyone wanted to find out more about your work and what you do, where would the best place for that be?
Yeah, look, people can find me on Substack is probably the best place. And so that's warwickpowell.substack.com. And I try to publish there once a week, something, and sometimes a couple of times a week, but don't get used to that. It just depends on whether the mood strikes and how productive I feel.
Yeah, great. I'll put that in the description below, but thanks again for your time.
Absolute pleasure.